Folks, welcome to another SPSC webinar conversation. It's been a while, David, since we've had you here. David Cronin is the author of a really great book called Balfour's Shadow. The title suggesting that Balfour's malign works still cast a long shadow on us today. Have I got that right, David?
That's
David's Irish. He's a Brussels-based journalist and has to navigate and work with the dark forces of the EU and report on the goings-on, David, yeah? So David's going to talk today, the crimes of empire from Ireland to Palestine, because the relationship is significant and intimate. And after David speaks, he wants to hold your attention for about half an hour or so. We'll move into Q&A. Now, can you post your questions on the chat? And we will try to answer as many as we possibly can. And those that we can't answer before we wind up at the top of the hour, probably, we'll try to answer later by email. But we'll try and answer all of them today. Yeah. Remember, there's no such thing as a stupid question. Any question you ask will stimulate an intelligent conversation. So, David, crimes of empire from Ireland to Palestine. On you go.
Thank you very much, Mick. Good evening, everybody. One of the most arresting political cartoons I've ever seen bears the caption, "Ireland wrestles with famine while Mr. Balfour plays golf." Dating from 1890, this cartoon serves as a reminder that hunger was an acute problem for a large part of the 19th century. The bellies of the Irish did not magically become full once the period in the 1840s, generally referred to as the Great Famine, petered out. Food shortages were still occurring while Arthur James Balfour was Britain's chief secretary, or the top colonial administrator for Ireland, a post which he held from 1887 until 1891. Although the cartoon I mentioned a moment ago is potent, we can see it, I think, on the screen now, it does not give a complete picture. It would be a misunderstanding of history to merely denounce Balfour for engaging in leisure pursuits as the people over whom he ruled were ground down by poverty. Balfour did not simply look the other way. Instead, he authorized extreme brutality against anyone who challenged the established order. Born in the Scottish village of Whittingham, Balfour hailed from an aristocratic background. Like so many other British supremacists, he was a graduate of Eton and Cambridge. Given this highly privileged upbringing, nobody should be surprised to learn that he had little sympathy for Ireland's excitable peasantry, as he called them. During his first speech in the British Parliament, after his appointment as Chief Secretary, Balfour unveiled legislation known as the Irish Crimes Act. Under this act, farm workers who defied the landed gentry faced 6 months of imprisonment with hard labour. The nickname Bloody Balfour was earned early during Balfour's stint in Ireland, or in charge of Ireland. Balfour earned this nickname because he praised police officers who opened fire on an 1887 protest in Mitchelstown, County Cork, killing 3 people. The protest had been called in support of William O'Brien, a politician and an agitator. William O'Brien led a campaign encouraging tenant farmers to withhold payments from landlords who would not reduce rents. Bloody Balfour had admirers as well as enemies. Among his biggest fans was Edward Carson, a politician still revered by many who wished to preserve the so-called union between the north of Ireland and Britain. As a lawyer, Edward Carson played a major part in the prosecution of William O'Brien. Carson was in Mitchelstown on the day the 1887 massacre took place and fully endorsed Balfour's response to it. According to Edward Carson, Balfour simply backs his own people up, and there wasn't an official in Ireland who didn't worship the ground he walked on. Following his time as Chief Secretary for Ireland, Balfour opposed Home Rule when the issue was debated in the British Parliament during the 1890s. Balfour availed of one such debate to display crude anti-Irish bigotry. He said, "The fact is that before English power went to Ireland, Ireland was a collection of tribes waging constant and internecine warfare without law, without civilization. Although the law is imperfectly obeyed, and although civilization may be imperfectly apprehended, all the law and all the civilization in Ireland is the work of England." While Balfour regarded the Irish, particularly Catholics, as inferior, he packaged his brand of unionism as progressive. In a highly condescending manner, he even tried to claim the Irish as kinfolk. In 1910, the Times newspaper quoted him as saying, "While I admit differences of degree, I will never admit that the Irish man is one race of inhabitants and England or Scotland or Wales is another race." Despite his professed devotion to law and order, Balfour sided with loyalists in the north of Ireland who engaged in illegal weapons smuggling. Insurrection could be required, he felt, if the government in London made too many concessions to Irish nationalists. After serving as a Conservative Prime Minister from 1902 to 1905, Balfour was alarmed by the Liberal government that held power for the next 10 years. He went so far as to insinuate that the Liberals' moves towards facilitating devolution for Ireland were treasonous. Ordinary canons of conduct necessarily become open to question in extreme cases, Balfour argued in 1912. The Liberals' whole treatment of the Home Rule question, he added, would justify any action which the Ulster Loyalists may take to maintain their rights. He would soon modify his hostility toward granting a certain amount of autonomy to Ireland. For reasons of realpolitik, Balfour accepted that devolution could take place, provided that it wouldn't apply to several northeastern counties. For Unionists, the least calamitous of all the calamitous policies was to exclude Ulster from Home Rule, Balfour contended in 1913. In April 1914, a large quantity of rifles and ammunition was smuggled into 3 Northern Irish ports for potential use by the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force. Balfour sought to justify the Larne gun-running operation, as it became known, by arguing that Loyalists found themselves in extraordinary circumstances of a kind which could only occur in 2 or 3 centuries without shattering the whole fabric of society. The weapons smuggling was regarded as so serious that it was condemned by such pillars of the establishment as Winston Churchill. Intriguingly, Balfour tweaked a slogan associated with Winston's father, Randolph Churchill, while speaking in Parliament. The slogan, which Randolph Churchill helped to popularise, is "Ulster will fight and Ulster will be right." Balfour said in 1914, "I hold now, and I held 30 years ago, that if Home Rule was forced upon Ulster, Ulster would fight and Ulster would be right." Balfour was Lord of the Admiralty, or the Navy's political master, for a few years during the First World War. He held that post when Ireland's Easter Rising erupted in April 1916. In written comments on the rebellion a few weeks later, Balfour alleged that it had disgraced Dublin. He noted that many of the rising's leaders had already been executed at that point, and insisted that the sentences decided on for other rebels would be fully carried out. Balfour advocated what he regarded as a pragmatic approach in the British cabinet discussions on addressing the consequences of the Easter Rising. Once a hardcore opponent of Home Rule, as I mentioned a little while ago, Balfour now viewed it as preferable to full independence. He would, however, continue to demand that Ulster, or a large chunk of that province, be treated differently. While he paid a visit to New York in the spring of 1917, Balfour met a number of Irish Americans who were deemed to be influential. Based on those conversations, he argued that settling the Irish question would, no doubt, greatly facilitate the vigorous and lasting cooperation of the United States government in the war. Similar lay behind the most infamous document to which Arthur Balfour attached his name. I am referring, of course, to the Balfour Declaration of November 1917. That pledge to support the establishment of a so-called national home for the Jewish people in Palestine clearly did not result from any altruistic motives. Rather, it reflected the belief that currying favor with Jews in Russia and the United States would be beneficial to Britain at a time when there were real fears that Britain could lose the First World War. Balfour put forward the case that most Jews in Russia and the United States had a positive view of Zionism, a statement that endorsed Zionist aspirations should allow Britain to conduct extremely useful propaganda in both Britain and America, Balfour claimed. The case made by Balfour was guided by hearsay rather than evidence. Far from being a powerful homogeneous bloc, Jews in Russia were actually victims of persecution. Balfour's Foreign Office ignored a report from the British ambassador in Petrograd, today's St. Petersburg, stating that Russian Jews did not have the clout to alter the course of the war. The wording of the Balfour Declaration was ambiguous, yet subsequent comments by Balfour leave no doubt that he was backing a colonization project under which European settlers would be accorded a much higher status than Palestine's indigenous population. In 1919, Balfour wrote, "We are dealing not with the wishes of an existing community, but are consciously seeking to reconstitute a new community and definitely building for a Jewish majority in the future." He also put forward the theory that Zionism was rooted in traditions, needs, and hopes of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. The Balfour document should be viewed as an imperialist document. Chaim Weizmann, the representative of the Zionist movement, who was most involved in the talks which led to the declaration, presented himself as a fervent Anglophile. Befriending the Jews of the world would, in Weizmann's words, be something that matters a great deal, even for a mighty empire like the British. The British Army was not as charmed by Zionists, certainly was not charmed by Zionists in the way that leading politicians were. Not long after the Balfour Declaration was issued in 1917, British troops wrested control of Palestine from Turkey. Edmund Allenby, the general commanding the British troops, banned all mention of the Balfour Declaration. Allenby's decree appears to have been sparked by worries that Arabs would rise up if Britain's backing of the Zionist colonization project was publicized. Within a few years, the Balfour Declaration had gone from being a simple letter to the Zionist movement to something that was being actively implemented. Its core objective, building the Jewish so-called national home, was enshrined in the League of Nations mandate, under which Britain would rule Palestine from the 1920s until the 1940s. In her book, The Hidden History of the Balfour Declaration, Sahar Huneidi identifies Herbert Samuel, Britain's first High Commissioner in Palestine, as being central to making Zionist aspirations a reality. Herbert Samuel was a committed Zionist who had played a significant part in the lobbying and the discussions which led to the Balfour Declaration. Samuel's extreme Zionist interpretation of the Balfour Declaration, Sahar Huneidi writes, tipped the scales towards the Zionists at a time when the Balfour Declaration itself was considered an experiment, the results of which were to be determined with the passage of time. The experiment made an impact. Through a series of ordinances, Herbert Samuel helped Zionist settlers to buy up land and evict Palestinian farmers en masse. The consequence of the experiment was that Britain transformed Palestine into a second Ireland. That was the verdict of the newspaper tycoon Alfred Harmsworth, also known as Lord Northcliffe, who paid a visit to Palestine in 1922. Harmsworth's observation was perceptive. Britain's rulers sought to crush resistance in Palestine using comparable means and often the same individuals they had inflicted on Ireland. Perhaps the most telling illustration of that fact is that the aforementioned Winston Churchill, Britain's colonial secretary during the early 1920s, assembled a militarized police force to deal with those Palestinians who were not sufficiently obedient for his liking. The force consisted of men from the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries. To this very day, the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries remain despised in Ireland. Their contribution to Ireland's War of Independence involved shooting dead numerous civilians and burning down houses, pubs, and factories. Arthur Balfour kept on praising the declaration bearing his name for its wisdom, as he put it in 1927. Balfour died 3 years later, so in 1930. The effects of the Balfour Declaration endured. Caroline Elkins pinpoints those effects in her book, Legacy of Violence. She writes about how by the 1930s, Palestine replaced Ireland as the official and unofficial training ground for colonial police indoctrination, and it produced scores of senior police officers and future paramilitary counterinsurgents for the entire empire. The skills acquired through such training were put to use when a major revolt took place in Palestine between 1936 and 1939. Britain's crushing of that revolt involved immense cruelty. Torture against detainees was approved at a high level. The thousands of people killed by the British included patients in hospital beds, and Jaffa's old city was largely destroyed, causing huge homelessness. The repression of the Palestine revolt was among Britain's worst crimes during the 20th century, though knowledge about this shameful period is woefully inadequate in present-day Britain. Hopefully, the success of Anne-Marie Jassir's new movie, Palestine 36, will alert the general public to facts that the British elite would happily erase from history. Britain did not just train its own officers in Palestine, it also trained the Zionist militia known as the Haganah. The Haganah was the main force responsible for expelling up to 800,000 Palestinians from their homes between 1947 and 1949. We should never forget, therefore, that a large proportion of the men who perpetrated the Nakba had been mentored by Britain. Nakba means catastrophe in Arabic. The catastrophe inflicted on Palestine in the 1940s never ended. Its consequences are being exacerbated by a genocide in the 2020s, a genocide that has not ended either. The British government, then led by Rishi Sunak, backed the genocide with considerable enthusiasm as it got underway in the last few months of 2023. Sunak's successor, Keir Starmer, has maintained the appalling situation whereby RAF reconnaissance flights taking off from and landing in Cyprus provide so-called intelligence to the Israeli military invaders carrying out the genocide in Gaza. Matt Kennard, a journalist who has meticulously monitored these reconnaissance flights, is 100% correct in pointing out that they make Britain a participant in the genocide. Rather than being held to account for taking part in the worst possible crime, Britain's rulers have banned Palestine action. The ban on Palestine action shows the absolute contempt in which the establishment holds ordinary people, particularly those with the courage to try and disrupt violations of international law. 6 ordinary people who have been imprisoned for opposing genocide are on hunger strike in British jails at this very moment. Just this week, we witnessed the sordid spectacle of elected representatives laughing in Westminster when a question about the hunger strikers was raised. I began this talk, my friends, by referring to an 1890 political cartoon captioned "Ireland wrestles with famine while Mr. Balfour plays golf." In December 2025, Gaza is still wrestling with starvation despite a so-called ceasefire. 6 brave people in British jails are refusing food in protest against how they are being punished for opposing a genocide. The genocide has been aided enormously by the British ruling elite. Rather than expressing any remorse for what they have done, members of that elite have the impudence to laugh. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. The circle is rounded, yeah? The circle is complete from the petri dish of Ireland at the turn of the 20th century being used as a school for oppression, and the exchange of personnel and skills between different bits of the empire. Friends, this is your time. Any questions, stick them in the chat and David will strive to answer them. Questions about historical questions or how he brought it up to the present day. David, I've got a question, if I may. The Zionist project was mystified for a long time. A lot of people, although we talk about settler colonialism now, it's actually fairly recent that we began to talk about Palestine in that way, a couple of decades possibly. And when we started using the term, then some people disagreed. But the idea, the sort of mysticism around the Bible, the way in which the Zionists use the Christian Jewish Bible to, in some bizarre way, claim this justifies land theft and expropriation and genocide. How do you see the use of the Bible by supremacist groups, colonizing groups, settler groups, actually, not just in Ireland and Palestine, but also in South Africa, the Boers and the whites doing the colonization, and the Spaniards, when they go to the New World, waved Bibles as well before exterminating the ungodly natives. Your thoughts, David?
Sure, I'll be very brief on this because it's not something that I have a huge amount of expertise on, but I would recommend, Mick, that people read Ilan Pape's book. It's not his most, I believe he actually has a more recent book. It came out about 2 years ago. It's called Lobbying for Zionism on Both Sides of the Atlantic. And Pape makes it quite clear that Zionism the roots of Zionism should really be seen, that Zionism should really be seen as a Christian ideology. It emerged really in, I suppose, in the middle of the 19th century with among Christians. The whole idea, I won't go into too much detail about this, but obviously partly because I don't fully understand it. To me as a lapsed Irish Catholic, it's quite bizarre. But the essential idea, just to explain, probably most of our listeners are aware of what Christian Zionism entails, but in case anybody isn't, I'll just give a very much a sort of paper.
I think people have a sense of it today, David, but you'd be surprised how many don't know that it starts off as
just in broad brush. I'll just deal with it in kind of broad brush strokes. The essential idea of Christian Zionism is that it's an interpretation of the Bible, the idea that Jews returning, in inverted commas, to the Holy Land will accelerate the second coming of the Messiah. That was an attractive idea among Christians at a certain point in the 19th century, and it was something to which senior politicians were attracted. These include David Lloyd George, who of course was the Prime Minister in 1917, at the time when the Balfour Declaration was issued. We shouldn't exaggerate. I mean, there's basically two reasons why Lloyd George was attracted to the Zionist project. Two reasons from this is based on his own record. The first one was his own Christian beliefs and his own interpretation of the Bible. The second reason was a much more hard-headed imperialist reason. He wanted to keep the French out of Palestine. That's essentially, and he pretty much said it in those terms. So but there was this kind of perverse alliance, I suppose, or marriage between Christian fundamentalism and imperialism that played a significant role. I'm not saying it was the only factor, but it did play a significant role in the thinking behind the Balfour Declaration and in subsequent developments. And it also explains why a significant proportion of the Protestant community, not all, I hasten to add, but a significant proportion of the Protestant community in the north of Ireland are attracted to Zionism and have supported Israel's crimes.
Thanks, David. How do you think that worked in terms of before the selection of Palestine by the Zionists, they did consider Madagascar, Uganda, Kenya at that time, a few other places. They finally settled on Palestine. What role did it play? How influential do you think it was that they could put forward a sort of ideological claim to be so-called returning? I mean, it's mad fantasy, but how significant do you think that might have been?
It was a factor. It was definitely a factor. I mean, it was among others. Yeah. There's no doubt. I mean, they did, as you said, they looked at as other options, but certainly Theodor Herzl, the founding father of Zionism, his preference was for Palestine, and Palestine became the focus of the Zionist movement in the late 19th century and the early 20th century.
Sir Ronald Storrs, the first Governor General of conquered Jerusalem, said famously that by supporting Zionism, Britain would get a loyal little Jewish Ulster in a sea of hostile Arabism. I mean, if you take that literally, it really does highlight that Ireland was a kind of template. The settlement of Ireland was a template for the settlement of Palestine. Your thoughts, David?
Yeah. I'm not the only one. I was actually gobsmacked by when I started researching for my book. I was gobsmacked. I had an inkling that there was connections. And the reason why I decided to write the book was largely through a casual conversation I had with a woman called, her name won't come to me at the moment, sorry, PLO, Karma Nabulsi, a former PLO negotiator who has subsequently taught in Oxford or Cambridge, I think in Oxford. But she was the one who told me, just in a casual conversation, she said, she asked me, do you realize that Churchill sent the black and tans to Palestine? And I had no idea about this. I mean, I was fascinated by this because I grew up in a town, it's called Balbriggan in County Dublin, which became synonymous with the black and tans. It was actually debated in Parliament in September 1920 because the black and tans burnt down a large part of my hometown, and this left, as you can imagine, a bitter legacy. I can remember in the 1980s, people still talking about this as if it had happened 6 months previously, rather than 6 decades previously. So this was fascinating to me. But then I didn't realize actually the extent of how much Ireland was in the minds of British imperialists dealing with Palestine until I started spending time in Britain's National Archives in Kew, and I wasn't sort of necessarily searching for. I was doing a research about the British and Palestine, so I was trying to gather as much information as I could. So I wasn't necessarily searching for Irish connections, but I just found them all the time, when I was doing that research. So from that it became abundantly clear that Ireland was a template. Chronologically, there's obviously a logic behind this. I mean, the British went to Palestine in the 1920s, just after Ireland's War of Independence. So when they encountered unrest in Palestine, there's a certain amount of logic to the fact that they were saying, well, what's the last unrest we have encountered? The most recent unrest at that time was in Ireland. So they were seeing things very much through the same kind of prism, and they were using the same kind of brutal methods. As you mentioned, the quote there from Ronald Storrs is particularly interesting, where he talked about Palestine being a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism. The second part of that quote is probably the most important, the fact that Britain wanted to get its hands on a significant part of the old Ottoman Empire. Palestine, of course, was close to its key interest from an economic point of view was the Suez Canal, a key shipping route between a key shipping route at that time in a key shipping route connecting so-called Middle East and Asia. The Middle East and India, apologies. So Palestine was obviously in that region, and Britain wanted to get its hands on it, and it also obviously was concerned about hostile Arabism, to use the words of Ronald Storrs, and it felt that the Zionists would be allies in dealing with this potentially hostile Arabism.
David, I've got a quick question. We've got a question from Lindsay. We'll take in a moment, but I'm going to ask my question as quickly as I can. 3 British military heroes, 3 statues within range of Westminster. Montgomery was involved in a terrible massacre, and a local bishop met with him afterwards. And he said, the man just talks of blood. To everything he says, we shall shoot them. The English Archbishop was horrified by his violence. Bomber Harris said, a £500 bomb dropped on any village that speaks out of turn will solve the problem. Just that aerial bombing. Wingate, the leader of the Chindits, who organised the night squads, one of his sergeants upbraided some of the Zionist militia members by saying, you don't even know how to stick a bayonet in a dirty Arab. Take those 3 together and you get, I think, a very sharp view of what colonialism was like in Palestine, the rough edge. What are your thoughts, David?
Yeah, actually, this comes back to the last question you asked about Ireland being a template for Palestine. Bernard Montgomery, or Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, as he became known, had been based in Cork with the British Army during the War of Independence. And after serving in Cork, he made comments to the effect that he never cared how many houses the British burned in Cork. Cork, actually, just like my hometown, Balbriggan, was burnt down. A large part of it, Cork, was burnt down, and Montgomery's argument was he never cared. As far as he was concerned, all these houses belonged to Shinners. Shinners, in case anyone doesn't know, is slang for a member of Sinn Féin, a supporter of Irish republicanism. Montgomery was called on to give advice about dealing with the Palestine revolt in the 1930s, and his advice was that Britain should show no leniency towards rebels. He did claim that a distinction should be drawn between combatants and non-combatants, but the way that he, in practice, no such distinction was actually drawn, and effectively he advocated a shoot to kill policy for Palestine, which is exactly the kind of policy that the British followed in Palestine.
David, question from Lindsay. Are the Irish getting it in the neck verbally in terms of barbs and insults from the Israelis at the moment and the Zionist movement because of Ireland's position compared to the other NATO countries?
Yeah, yes, in a word. I don't know if anyone has been following quite an interesting story in Dublin about last week or 2 weeks ago. The Gideon Sa'ar, the Israeli foreign minister, called called on the Irish, basically went on X, formerly known as Twitter, and erupted over, had a hissy fit about a proposal to rename a park in Dublin called Herzog Park. This park in Rathgar on the south side of Dublin was named after Chaim Herzog, who had Irish connections. Chaim Herzog was a president of Israel and is the father of the current president of Israel. And anyway, Dublin. This was a local authority issue. Okay, I'll just explain briefly. Dublin City Council had voted to rename this park some time ago, pretty much by an overwhelming majority, as far as I recall. But so it was really, this was a matter for Dublin City Council, nobody else. A matter for local government in Ireland. Yet, because of the pressure exercised by the Israeli government, the Irish government got involved, the Central Irish government, Federal Irish government got involved in this local authority issue and essentially insisted that the renaming would not go ahead. Unfortunately, the unelected officials that essentially run Dublin County Council capitulated to pressure from both the Irish government and from the Israeli state. So this shows, I find this absolutely bewildering that Israelis should get their undergarments in a twist over a park that hardly anybody has heard of on the south side of Dublin. But this shows you how how they really want, they just won't give an inch, and we shouldn't be in any way accommodating towards them. Unfortunately, the Irish government does not speak for the Irish people. The Irish government is willing to accommodate demands from Israel.
But one question in relation to that, you express surprise that they'll get you're really worried about the changing of the name of a small park in Dublin. But I suppose you remember a few months ago when a Japanese B&B, when a tiny Japanese inn asked all visitors to sign a statement that they were not involved in war crimes. The Israeli ambassador got in touch with the Japanese government and demanded that this not be allowed. It couldn't possibly be allowed. So there's an element of fragility there, isn't there? In fact, I remember a few years ago when Palestine Action was just kind of getting known, a few people went on the London Underground. And you know those adverts that you can see on the carriage, they replaced them with pro-Palestine messages. And Netanyahu and ministers were in contact with the British government to demand that this atrocity on the metro shouldn't be allowed. So tremendous fragility. They are really afraid of any opposition. And I think there should be a message in that for our listeners. What do you think, David?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The other example in which which Ireland has shown extreme weakness, the Irish government has shown extreme weakness towards Israel, and this is probably more significant than a park on the south side of Dublin, concerns legislation to ban imports from Israel's settlements in the occupied West Bank. Some years ago, 2018, if memory serves me correctly, both houses in the Oireachtas, the Irish Parliament, passed legislation that would ban imports of both goods and services from Israel's settlements. Under pressure from Israel and the United States, the Irish government blocked this legislation, despite how it had been approved by majorities in both houses of the Irish Parliament. The Irish government has subsequently said that it is more favourably disposed towards that legislation because of the issues arising from South Africa, the case taken by South Africa in 2024, where South Africa took Israel to the International Court of Justice under the Genocide Convention. Yet the legislation has still not come into effect, and there are major doubts about whether it will ever come into effect because of pressure applied on Ireland. Belgium and Spain have both introduced similar legislation, and I live in Belgium. The sky hasn't fallen in Belgium because Belgium has moved to ban goods and I think services also from Israel's settlements. So why is the Irish elite so afraid?
They're afraid of Trump and his gang in Washington. And if you attack Israel, you upset the headquarters, the Home Office. No,
that undoubtedly is a major issue. Mike Huckabee, the United States ambassador in Tel Aviv, no, he's not in Tel Aviv anymore. He's actually in Jerusalem. The United States ambassador to Israel alleged that the Irish had fallen into a vat of Guinness because of this legislation, the Occupied Territories Bill, as it's called, and called on the Irish to sober up. Needless to say, that reflects quite racist thinking about the Irish.
Well, let's not take a look at the Israeli sense of humour. That must have been,
this is Mike Huckabee.
That must have had them rocking
American.
the aisles, or Huckabee's pro-Israel sense of humour. It often extends to T-shirts about the killing of children and pregnant women. That's a great joke. David, I've got some announcements, but before I make those announcements, do you want to make some concluding remarks? Anything else that you want to say to the viewers?
No, nothing major. I just encourage people to do what you can to support the hunger strikers. At the moment, it's frightening what is happening. And it's frightening the way that they're being ignored by the ruling class. David Lammy, the Justice Secretary, claimed, is he Justice Secretary or Home Secretary, claimed recently not to even know about what's going on.
Could you speak about that, David, through the prism of it from an Irish point of view? Very significant.
Well, of course. I mean, the last time that there was a hunger strike on this scale in the so-called United Kingdom was in the early 1980s, when 10 Irishmen starved themselves to death because Margaret Thatcher wouldn't concede the fact that they were political prisoners. History is repeating itself. There's the difference. We were talking to some friends about this. There is a bit of a difference. I mean, the British media could not ignore the Irish hunger strike in the early 1980s. But as far as I can see, the British establishment, including the media, for the most part, with some exceptions, there's been a couple of stories, but the British establishment is trying to totally ignore this hunger strike at the moment.
David, thank you very much. Thanks to everybody for joining us, especially thanks to a group in Edinburgh who got together to watch the webinar. Edinburgh, of course, being the site of the biggest arts festival in the world, which has been free of any Israeli presence for about 14 years, due to the efforts of Solidarity campaigners. We have to defend that. David's right, the hunger strikers are front and central for us, not because their suffering is greater than in Gaza. I mean, children have been dying, and a child died last night of cold, froze to death because Israel is still blocking supplies. So the genocide continues, the deliberate killing and harming of Palestinian people continues, and that's genocide. So let's have them not just in our thoughts, but in our actions. In everything we do, leaflets, meetings, talks, hunger strikers need to be front and central. A few announcements. Demonstration in Glasgow on Saturday, 1 o'clock. The hunger strikers will be very much to the fore there, and there'll be a friend or relative of one of the hunger strikers who'll be speaking, but that'll be a theme running through the whole demonstration. Glasgow, by the way, there's been a small victory. You know, this T-shirt here. This T-shirt evoked a threat from Police Scotland to arrest anyone and charge anyone with terrorism who wore this T-shirt. I think I'm inviting arrest by just showing you it. Genocide in Palestine, crime, time to take action. We now learn that the CPS in England and Wales ruled as far back as August that this T-shirt is not prosecutable. But tell that to the Scottish cops who continue to arrest people. I got a text today. One woman has her sign was I support Palestine action, I oppose genocide. She said 7 visits from the cops in the last few days. So they're still arresting all over the place, but they're also still arresting people who wear these T-shirts. But it's a victory, and we will, at the end of the day, win this one. But that has to be matched against the somber reality of a hunger strike where we fear the worst. But we're going to call a demonstration at the beginning of the early new year, wearing these T-shirts outside the police station on London Road in Glasgow, and we ask other people to do the same thing across Scotland. I'm on trial on Monday for abusing the leader of Glasgow Friends of Israel, a man who welcomes the euthanizing of Palestinians, whose group welcomed the massacre of Muslims in New Zealand mosques, and who called for a woman who supported the Palestinians, a Muslim lawyer, to be strangled with her own headscarf. They're lovely people, but yet I'm charged with abusing them. So that'll be an interesting trial in Glasgow on Monday. Edinburgh Festival, keep it clear of them, the T-shirt, my little trial. Yeah, we've also got a webinar on Sunday because of the terrible massacre in Australia and the fact that Netanyahu was quick to try to weaponize it against us and against the Palestinians. We've got a webinar at 12 noon on Sunday. Naomi Junor, Jewish comrade, Kat Train, Tony Greenstein, Jewish comrade who is a heavy hitter against Zionism. And they'll be talking about the weaponization of this terrible massacre, Zionism and anti-Semitism. Sunday, 12 o'clock, next webinar. That's about it from me. David, a big thanks for joining us again. The Irish perspective is invaluable in that you were the place where they incubated some of their vile tactics and genocide. Thanks, everybody. Thanks again. Good night. Never forget the hunger strikers. Never forget children dying of cold in Gaza. And never forget that our government was the prime mover and remains a prime facilitator of that genocide. Good night.